this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today we're going to do a bit more British history reading in a whisper from this history magazine, and the article is about the Vikings. Why did the violent raids begin? So this is by Robert Ferguson, who argues that the chief motivation behind the Vikings' brutal raids on the British Isles was the need to defend their culture in the face of a Christian onslaught. Now, the wonderful black and white photograph in the background of this article is Holy Island, or Lindisfarne, just off the coast of Northumbria. A savage raid on the island's monastery in 793 heralded the start of England's Viking era. So, let's take a read. On a clear day, a Viking longship at sea could be seen some service as the monastery at Jarrow, and reported that its protector, St. Cuthbert, had not let the heathen go unpunished, for their chief was killed by the English, and these things befell them rightly, for they had gravely injured those who had not injured them. Shetland and Orkney were probably overrun during the first wave of violence, and the indigenous population of Picts wiped out so swiftly that local place names and the names of natural phenomena, such as rivers and mountains, vanished, to be replaced by Scandinavian names. Ireland and the Western Isles of Scotland suffered too. The Annals of Ulster report the burning in 795 of the monastery at Recrew, and the Isle of Skye, overwhelmed and laid waste. Iona was attacked for a first time in 795, and again in 802. In a third raid in 806, the monastery was torched and the community of 68 wiped out. Work started the following year on a safe refuge for the revived community at Kells in Ireland. In 799, the island monastery of Noirmoutier off the northwest coast of France was attacked for the first time. By 836 it had been raided so often that its monks also abandoned the site and sought refuge in a safer location. It soon became clear, however, that there was no such thing as a safe refuge. Why such hatred, and why 793 rather than 743 or 843? We need to examine the political situation in Northern Europe at the time to look for a triggering event. At the commencement of the Viking Age, the major political powers in the world were Byzantium in the east, the Muslims, whose expansion had taken them eastward as far as Turkestan and Asia Minor to create an Islamic barrier between the northern and southern hemispheres, and the Franks, who had become the dominant tribe among the successor states after the fall of the Roman Empire in the west. Charlemagne became sole ruler of the Franks in 771. He took seriously the missionary obligations imposed on him by his position as the most powerful ruler in Western Christendom, and expended a huge amount of energy on the subjugation of the heathen Saxons on his northeast border. In 772, his forces crossed into Saxon territory and destroyed a Minsel, the sacred tree that was the most holy totem. In 779, Widukind, the Saxon leader, was defeated in battle at Bocholt, and Saxony taken over and divided into missionary districts. Charlemagne himself presided over a number of mass baptisms. In 782, his armies forcibly baptized and then executed 4,500 Saxon captives at Verdun, on the banks of the river Aller. Campaigns of enforced resettlement followed, but resistance continued until a final insurrection was put down in 804. By this time, Charlemagne had already been rewarded for his missionary activities by Pope Leo III, who in 800 crowned him Imperator in Rome. is there any hope of our converting the Danes? Should the Vikings simply wait for Charlemagne's armies to arrive and set about the task, or should they fight to defend their culture? A military campaign against the might of Frankish Christendom was out of the question. However, the Christian monasteries, like Lindisfarne, dotted around the rim of northern Europe, were symbolically important, and in the parlance of modern terrorist warfare, soft targets. So, with an indifference to the humanity of their victims as complete as that of Charlemagne's towards the Saxons, these first Viking raiders were able to set off on a punishing series of attacks in the grip of a no-holds-barred rage directed at Christian others. The Christian annalists who documented Viking violence insistently saw the conflict as a battle between religious cultures. 100 years after Lindisfarne, Asser, in his biography of Alfred the Great, continued to refer to the much larger bands of Vikings, who had by now established themselves along the eastern seaboard of England as the pagans, Pagani, and to their victims as Christians, Christiani. Attacks such as those mounted by Vikings were almost impossible to defend against, and long before Asser's time, the raiders had discovered how easy it was to plunder what was probably the richest country in Western Europe. In 851, a fleet of 350 ships sailed up the Thames to attack London, and Canterbury. And instead of sailing home, spent the winter encamped at Thanet. It was a prelude to the arrival in 865 of what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the Great Heathen Army, a force which, after 15 years of warring against the demoralised kingdoms of Northumbria, Wessex, Mercia and East Anglia, had gained control of England from York down to East Anglia. So, let's just have a look at some of the images before we continue. So this very nice colourful one is a 10th century vellum showing Viking warriors disembarking in England during the second wave of migration. And then here we have a map showing the balance of power in Europe in 813. So we have the Frankish Empire in a kind of dark blue, going all the way from the bottom of Italy up to what now is modern day France and right across. And then in the orange we have Denmark and the sphere of influence of Danish kings in about 800. Across here is the Emirate of Cordoba. This is the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople is just there. Here is the Abbasid Caliphate, North Africa. And then up here, tiny Britain, Lindisfarne, just here, York, and these are the areas of Mercia and Wessex. Okay, let's carry on with the reading. By 927, much of the lost territory had been regained by the Wessex king Alfred the Great and his son Edward and grandson Athelstan. But by that time, the achievements of the Great Heathen Army had become part of the cultural history of young Viking males. large-scale Viking violence returned to England during the reign of King Ethelred in the 990s under the Dane Sven Forkbeard, great name, and the Norwegian Olaf Tryggvason. The policy of the Danegeld, protection money paid in return for being left alone, was practised with a punishing regularity. It was with wealth gained in this fashion that the Viking Olaf Tryggvason financed his successful bid for the crown of Norway in 995. In 1012, the Archbishop of Canterbury was captured, and when the ransom demanded for him was not forthcoming, was murdered for the sport of a drunken group of men under the Viking Earl Thorkel the Tall. They pelted him with bones, stones, blocks of wood, and the skulls of cattle, before finishing him off with the flat of an axe. The loss of its spiritual head brought the faltering Anglo-Saxon monarchy to its knees, and within 2 years a Danish king, Sven Forkbeard, was on the throne of England. By 1028, Sven's son, Canute, was ruler of the North Sea Empire that included Denmark, with Skane in Sweden, Norway, and all England. In name at least, the heathens were now Christians, but their pride in themselves and conquering warriors remained strong. A poem in praise of Canute, composed by his Icelandic court poet Sigvat, invoked the memory of the Northumbrian king, Ella of York, defeated in battle by Ivar the Boneless during the first surge of the great heathen army, and Ivar, who dwelt in York, carved the eagle on Ella's back. Remarkably, Canute's triumphs were figured in Sigvat's literary imagination as the successful resolution of a conflict that had been going on for over 150 years, beginning as a series of gestures of cultural self-defence, and soon after developing into dreams of conquest. Alcuin had foreseen the ultimate consequences of the first Viking raid of 793 with visionary precision. Who does not fear this? He asked King Ethelred of Northumbria. Who does not lament this, as if his country were captured? In his distress, he was overlooking the fact that the Vikings were only doing what his own Saxon forefathers had done to the Britons and Celts of the kingdoms of England some 3.5 centuries earlier, conquering this fair land by the same means, violence, as the Vikings. Canute was unlucky with his sons, and Danish rule in England lasted less than 30 years. 15 years on, and the memories of King Canute and his North Sea Empire were all but wiped out by the greater drama of Duke William of Normandy's conquest of 1066. Now, in an image at the top, we see Sven Forkbeard landing in England. So this is an image from circa 1013 and establishes himself as king. Right, let's go back a little bit. So here we have a timeline at the bottom. I'll just open this out. sixth king, Alfred, formally recognises the Viking chieftain Guthrum as king of East Anglia. Guthrum agrees to baptism, taking and using the Christian and Anglo-Saxon name Athelstan. To record his achievement in making the Danes Christian, the stone is the first significant representation of Christ in Scandinavia. 1012. The sack of Canterbury and murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury presages the fall of Anglo-Saxon England. Within 4 years, Harold's grandson Canute is King of England. 1028. Canute's North Sea Empire reaches its greatest extent with the acquisition of Norway. It also includes England, Denmark, and much of southern Sweden. 1034. The canonisation of Olaf Haraldsson, a former Viking, who was baptised and became King of Norway. During his reign, Christian culture is firmly institutionalised in Norway. 1104. The Archbishopric of Lund in southern Sweden is created, the first in Scandinavia. This marks the end of heathendom as the prevailing religious and political culture in the region. There were 3 other explanations for Viking violence. Number 1. Technological advances that encouraged piracy. The onset of the Viking Age coincided with the appearance of the technologically advanced sail-powered longship. The stealth bomber of its time. Longships like the Oseberg ship, built in 820, replaced giant man-powered vessels like the Storhawk ship found on Karmay, buried in 779, opening up the seas to young Scandinavian pirates as never before. And these are replicas of both ships. 2. Poverty and overpopulation. In his History on the Manners and Deeds of the First Norman Dukes, 995 to 1015, Dudo of San Quentin wrote that, in former times in the Scandinavian homelands, quarrels over land and property were resolved by the drawing of lots. Losers were condemned to a life abroad where by fighting they can gain themselves countries. And third, a flood of riches into Scandinavia. Trading led to an influx of silver, bullion into Scandinavia from the Islamic world, creating elites around which ambitious young men gathered. Leaders had to reward these men for their military support.